it the tab? Does it hang up? No, not too far.
We ask this question at every meal, right? So, we're the land of chili, hatch green chili. It's sold all over the country. It's much better fresh, not as good in can, but, hold on. So, we're gonna make a pie chart. So we're gonna say, who prefers green? We'll say 45 people prefer green. We'll choose green. And then we'll say, okay, who wants red? I prefer red, so I'll say 68 people want red. And does anyone know the third option?
Yellow.
Yes. Christmas. Okay, 37 people want Christmas. So that's orange. Okay, so there's my nice pie chart, but maybe I want to do something different. Maybe I want to do an exploding offset. Maybe I want to make it 3D or change the position of the labels or rotate the chart or add a donut bowl and all this stuff. This is what's possible with Gutenberg. You can see what you're building. You can see really fancy things like data visualization. You can build it as you go and see what it's going to look like. We can update the page, and we can view the post. And unless something broke, there we go. Exactly what we saw in the back end. Beautiful, right? This is what makes Gutenberg exciting for me, because this is a huge improvement over what we have right now. All right, so the Christmas tree did not burn down. So, some basics about Gutenberg. Gutenberg puts everything in the content. So, goodbye post meta, with some exceptions. If you're used to building with post meta, and you use post meta for things outside of just displaying, there are ways that you can actually sync a block with post meta. So if you need to, flag this post as having something special that can't be used in a taxonomy, you can still use post meta for that, so that's good, but you don't need to. It's saved in the content, which is beneficial because that's used by default in the search, and it's less queries. And then Gutenberg, the way you interact with it is by changing attributes, and we'll get into that a lot more. There's a lot of resources on building Gutenberg stuff. The handbook gets better all the time. I still end up reading source code frequently when I'm trying to figure things out, and that's all on GitHub. And when you register a block, the two things that you're going to be doing the most of is you're going to have an editor, or an edit method and a save method. The edit method is how you interact with those attributes, how you change those attributes. You saw me with the pie chart interacting with the attributes, changing those. And then the save method is responsible for taking those attributes and saving it, creating HTML to be saved into the content area. So in the content area, you just get some HTML, kind of like what I have listed here. The attributes are also saved in the content. And there's two ways that you can save these attributes. One is as JSON data, much like this one, which is the attributes for that HTML I was just showing you. But you can also attach the attribute to a selector. So you could say like a p tag with this ID or with this class, so that you don't need to create all the JSON in the comments. It can actually just reparse the HTML and say, this selector gets pulled into this attribute. And then on the editor side, Gutenberg reads the attributes for that and then uses that editor method to help you interact with those. And the front end of the site does not run React. So that's a common misconception that I've run into. React runs in the dashboard. What is saved is HTML in the content, and then WordPress then just does its regular WordPress thing with that content. I'm going to go over just a really simple example just to kind of go over things conceptually, then we'll kind of talk about some more strategies in approaching these blocks. So a very simple example, You register the block type. There is has to be a unique name spacing and then name. So like this one CGB / block default example. And then there's some different things that you need to add. There's a title that you can add an icon that shows up when you press the little plus button so you can find it. But the big thing is, so you register the block, and then you have attributes. So those are the things we interact with. You can have what type is it and if there's a default. And then here is a very simple example. I write this stuff using JSX and ES20 or ES6, but you can also just do vanilla JavaScript. But a lot of the examples you'll find are using JSX. And so, very simple, what we're doing is we have a method, we have some JSX, which is kind of HTML-like JavaScript that can execute JavaScript, with some things that are different, like class is a reserved name in JavaScript, so you can't use that. Use class name instead. And all we're doing here is we're saying, is this block selected? If it is, we're going to show an input, and otherwise we're going to show what's going to be saved on the front end. And then our save method looks exactly the same, except it doesn't have that logic, is this selected, to show the input. So it's very simple, but that's basically all a Gutenberg block needs to be. This is obviously a really boring one, but those are the basic pieces of it. Gutenberg also allows for templating, which I think is, again, another really big selling point. If you have a custom post type, for instance, and I pulled this from the handbook, they have a custom post type of book, and in that there's a template that it's an array of blocks, and in there you can put in defaults, you can put in placeholders, and you can even lock it down. And so if you think about the improvement of this experience, instead of like having post meta, you open up a book and there's all these, you have your content and then you have all these fields you need to fill out, and there's really no context for what that field is or what it's going to look like. Now what you can do is you can say, oh, I'm going to add a new book, and now I have some default content so that people get a sense of, oh, this is where my picture is, this is my title, this is who the author is, etc. They'll see what the page looks like, and they'll just click on the different things and change the content to be what they want it to be. Okay, so, and if I'm going fast, I'm sorry, there's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. When you write React, the browser cannot execute React. There's some movement to change that, at least in some things, but for the most part, you're going to need to compile this down to just vanilla JavaScript, and that can be a huge hassle. When I started doing React, there weren't a lot of tools, and you had to set up your own. I set up Babel or Webpack, and it was this huge hassle. But now there's a lot of really great tools that do things like rebuild your project. They'll do a development build, a production build. And based on Create a React App, which is a very popular tool for React, there's another tool for Gutenberg called Create Gutenblock, and it's very easy. If you have Node installed, you can globally install Create Gutenblock, and then anywhere in your terminal you can just run npm create Gutenblock and then name it, and it will build you like a skeleton of the project, install Node modules and everything that you need for it to work. So what is built in? There's a lot of stuff that's built into Gutenberg that makes it very easy to build these blocks. And they're adding more and more all the time, which is really nice. And even in some of the examples, as I've gone through some time, I've been able to pull out a ton of code because they've introduced a feature that I've had to write a lot of code for in the past. The biggest one that you're going to use is set attributes. Again, what are you doing? You're interacting with the attributes. Set attributes is a built-in method that allows you to change those attributes, and it also signals the editor that you've made a change and now you can save the post again. Is selected is a way to see is someone selecting my block? Are they interacting with it, or is it unselected and they're viewing something else? And then there's all sorts of editor components: plain text, rich text, media upload, color palette. You can see the complete list on GitHub, and there's quite a bit. And if you're used to doing work using NPM, you can use a lot of NPM packages will work with this. It's really useful for extending default functionality. And NPM has the first one will be a simple statistics block. What do we want to do? We want to have users input as many statistics as we want, as they wish, and have a simple count up animation. So I'll do a little demo of what we're going to build, or what we're going to go over. It's just a simple thing that it counts up, right? Okay, so it works with any number of statistics that we want, although it might get crowded if we do too many, but that's the kind of thing that we're building. So, what are some strategies that we need to use? We talked about attributes and interacting with attributes. Attributes can be really picky, but Gutenberg does allow for an array to be an attribute, and you can put anything you want in that array. So it's kind of like if you've worked with a Mongo database, it's kind of freeing. Oh, I can just throw anything I want in here, but then it's also up to you to be responsible with that. Some other things. We don't get the JavaScript interactivity in our save method. Okay, so we need to, because we're just saving HTML, so we need another way to do the count up animation. So what we're going to do in this example is we're going to use data attributes in HTML to save our Gutenberg attributes on each statistic, and then we'll just use a jQuery script to parse those attributes and start the animation. So this is maybe, hopefully it's not too complicated, it's just something that you might have done in another. There's a lot of like count up libraries or other kind of libraries that just use data attributes and then parses them. So, to get started with a block, you always need to just import some things. If you use create Guten block, you'll get a style.scss and editor.scss. For style is global to both front and back end, and then editor is specific to the back end. And then you just need to import a few things. You always need to import register block type, and then we're just importing a few other things, including the plain text component. We register the block type. This is a lot like what we looked at before. You just need a name, a title, an icon. All that stuff is really easy to find online. And then we'll set up our attributes. So we have our stats, type is array, so it defaults to an empty array. And then in this instance, we're just going to use a random key so that the jQuery script can parse each set of statistics separately. Another thing about how Gutenberg works, if you set a default here, like doing something like math.random, so each one has a random key, it actually saves it and only like does it once, so each one will have whatever the same random key, so it's not a random key. So our edit method, if you're not, I don't know how familiar everybody is, I didn't ask, with ES6, but what you actually get passed in as the parameter for the edit and the save method is just called props. But we are going to destructure these so that we get these variables already separated out. And then we have a little method that we just say if our attributes random key is just the thing that we set it to as the default, we're going to give it a new random key and reset that attribute. And now we're just going to start building our little pieces. So in React, you're often building little pieces of functionality that you then can reuse. In this instance, we're just going to add a button that all it does is it adds a new row. So we're going to add a new row of statistics. And all that does is on the onClick event, we just create a new object to put in our array, and then we resave our attributes. Okay? Is this all making sense? Okay, good. We're going to create a delete button, which does the opposite. We take the index of whatever's being deleted, and we are going to remove it from the array, reset the attributes. Okay, and then this is just a little helper for our plain text inputs. We've got a bunch of these. Each instance of our statistics has both a label and a number, and so this is just a little abstraction to make it a little easier to work with, and all we're going to do is on change, we're going to save whatever it is. Again, save it to the attributes, set the attributes. So, and this is all available on GitHub. So I just want to make sure we can kind of get through the concepts and then have time for questions. This is just using the CountUp library that we're going to be using. It's very easy, very simple. And then we're going to look at the return. So the return is what we are going to see. This is returning HTML that we are interacting with. And all we're doing in this case is we have our class name, we have a little container, and then what we're going to do is we're going to map through our stats. Our stats are an array, so we're just going to map through and we're going to render those to the screen. And there's just a little helper here that if the block isn't selected, we're going to wait 100 milliseconds and then start the CountUp function. And then this is a lot like our example again. If it's selected, we're going to have our input. If it's not selected, we're going to show the HTML. And the same thing here. But again, if it's selected, we'll also show the delete stat button. And if it's selected, we'll show the add row button. Sorry, this is like cut up. It'll help if you look at the GitHub and you can kind of see it all in context. And then the save method is the same without the interactivity. We have our container, we map through our stats, and then this is the map expanded, and all we're doing is we're just returning what these statistics are going to look like. And if you notice, there's a data value that has our CountUp number, which will then use the CountUp script to count up. Okay. Does that make sense? Hopefully you see it. You actually aren't writing that much, but you're able to build a lot. And again, the goal is we want to have that flexible amount of data, and so we just use an array and we let them add as many items as they want. And we have a simple CountUp animation, but since we don't get that interactivity in our save method, we have to save those attributes in the HTML and then use jQuery to parse them. So another quick example that's going to look really different is just a simple weather block. Some goals we have for that is we're going to use the Open Weather API. So we want a weather API key, but we don't want our users to save that API key for every single block. So we want that to be a global setting. But then we are going to have some specific settings to those blocks. So they're going to set their temperature units, if they're in the US or if they are using Celsius. And then we also want users to set which city they want in each weather block. So I'll show you guys just a super brief demo of that. Let's see if it, okay. So there we have what the block is going to look like. On the right hand side we have some advanced settings where we can change the units. Right, we'll change it to Celsius. And we have our API key that we can save. Oh, I guess I didn't test that with the newest version of Gutenberg. So, okay, so what are some strategies that we want to use here? All right, this time we're going to use server-side rendering, okay? Why we don't want to expose our API key. We'll save our API key in the WP options table so that it's global and we can access it from all of our weather blocks. And then we're going to use those right-hand controls called inspector controls for the temperature unit. And we're going to do something different. We're going to actually use a React component for the edit method so that we have access to local state and the React component lifestyle. And if you're not familiar with those things, those are like a whole nother topic, but if you're familiar, there's a lot of languages that use lifecycle. I don't think anything in WordPress really does it, but it's basically there's different events that happen at different times that fire off different methods. So this time we're going to start in PHP. We're going to register our block in a PHP file. And there's all the functions. It should look pretty similar. We're going to register the block type. We have our namespacing and the name. And then we're going to set some attributes of our city and our units. And then we have this other parameter called render callback, which is which function is going to render the block. And then this function, it's just a simple API request. We're going to get our API key. If our city is set and we have an API key, we'll make a request to the open weather API. We're going to decode our data, change our units into something a little more readable, and then we'll return some HTML. Hopefully that doesn't seem too foreign. So on the JavaScript side, as people are interacting, there's a few more things that we're going to import. We're going to import component, which is it's the WordPress kind of wrapper around a React component. We're going to import our inspector controls, which deal with those right-hand controls. And then we're going to have a few more controls that we import this time, and plus a component called server-side render. Again, we have to register the block in JavaScript as well as PHP, so this is a little bit of code duplication. And the edit method, so edit can take a method and any React component is actually in, so we're going to pass a whole React component as edit. And then the save, since we are doing server-side rendering, we actually don't need to save HTML because that's going to be rendered on the server. So that's all we do is return null for that. For the editor component, this is, if you're familiar building React, this is going to look, it should look really familiar. If you're not familiar with building React, you'll have to learn a little bit to kind of get used to how this works. But we have a constructor that sets our initial state, and then we use our life cycle. So did the component mount? If it did, it's going to fire this. And what we're going to use, we're just going to use the WAPI JavaScript to get our simple weather API key from the options table. And we're going to save it to the state. And what that means, state in a component sense is data that it keeps track of that is specific scope to that component. So it'll just make our component aware this is our API key. And then we'll have a save API key method, which is what I need to look at. That broke. All we're going to do is we're going to start by setting in the state, is saving to true. And all that's going to do is say, is our component saving this API key? If it is, we'll do that fancy button animation that says, hey, we're working. And then we'll use, again, the WP API library to save those settings. And then if you look just down here, I have this update math random. I said before that the editor is aware if you've changed attributes, and since someone has saved the API key, we're just going to do a little fake change to the attributes so that the editor is aware, hey, there's a change made and I can save it. And our render is going to be pretty different actually than the other one because our preview is going to work different. And I'll show you what happens. If it's selected, what we're going to do is we're going to show our inspector controls. Those are the right-hand side. We'll have a select control, which was for the units, text control for the API key, and a button that saves it. And then these are just what they are expanded. again, it's very simple. You have some props with some options, and on change, what do? Set attributes, right? That's all we're doing, changing attributes. Our text control and our button, those are what fires off the save API key method. And the is inspector control component, what that does, that wrapper, that is what puts it on the right-hand side of the settings. So you don't really need to worry about anything with that other than I've imported inspector controls, I wrap what I want in there, and then it shows up in that right-hand menu. Okay. And then this is, again, in our return. If the block is selected, we'll show the text control to set the city name. Otherwise, we're going to show nothing. We're going to we'll just show null. And then Gutenberg has this really useful component called server-side render, where all you do is you say what block it is, and you pass in the attributes, and it'll do an API request to that function that you have registered as the render callback, and it will show it for you. So you don't even need to build it. You only need to build that once, which used to not be the case. So they make it really easy. And what I think is nice too is if you're a lot more comfortable with PHP, you can still do a lot of stuff in PHP and just use the server-side render if you're worried about how do I do the interactivity. There is a request made, so it's not as instant, but it's a really nice way to get started. So again, just going over our goals and strategies, we wanted to globally save the API key and then have settings that were specific to that block, to that instance of that block, like the weather units and the city. And what the strategies we use server-side rendering, not to expose our API key. We saved our API key on the options table, and then we used our inspector controls to kind of have some extra settings on the right-hand side. And we used the React component for the edit method so that we could have access to local state for the API key and also the React component lifecycle so we knew when the component mounted so we could go and fetch our API key. All right. That's a lot. This is like drinking from a fire hose at the end of a long day. Hopefully you guys are doing okay. There are a lot of gotchas around Gutenberg that, especially if you don't come from the React world, might be very frustrating. And one of them is validation. So React, as I said, or Gutenberg, if you think about Gutenberg as an HTML parser, I think that's really helpful. Because what it's going to do is going to say, I have this HTML, maybe I've got some data in these JSON comments, maybe I've got the data attached to these selectors, right, these HTML elements, but all it does is it takes that HTML, parses it, and then creates the attributes. And what happens with validation is that if your component, if your markup doesn't match, if your save method doesn't match the validation that it's expecting from its parser, it's going to say, hey, something's changed here. And what's trying to prevent it, or it's trying to alert you, is if somebody has changed the content outside of the Gutenberg editor or something else has happened, it's going to alert you that, hey, my parsing process doesn't match what you have here. And when that happens, it's going to have a red box and you're going to get console errors. And so you really want to be careful with how you deal with attributes. And one of the ways that you do that, you have to set a default attribute for everything. Or you have to declare the attribute. Some other gotchas, arrays don't allow for declaration of sub-attributes, so you have to be careful. It's up to you to keep track of that. Set attributes has no callback. So in React, if you come from the React world, there's set state, which acts a lot like set attributes, but there's a callback. So when it has finished setting state, you can pass in a second parameter of a function and it will run it. So that's really useful. You say, okay, I know the state is updated now, and now I can do this next step. Gutenberg doesn't have that yet. I keep on saying I should write that and put in a pull request. And then the other gotcha, I think, that is maybe a little hard for people to overcome is the fact that the out-of-the-box components won't look like the front end. And that's why I always use isSelected, because isSelected allows you to understand, is the user interacting with my block or not? And if they're interacting, I'm going to change everything and say, okay, now here are some inputs you can type into, maybe a button to change an image, whatever it is. But when they're not interacting with it, I think they should see the true markup that they're going to get on their front end. And so if you don't do that, and you just use like plain text or rich text, it won't look the same. So using isSelected is a really great way to show the user exactly what they're going to see. And there's also a function or a component called inner blocks, which allows for nested blocks. That's getting better. I think it's still officially in beta, but I think once inner blocks really solidifies, we're going to start to have what I think maybe some people are going to miss if they come from a page builder, which is the idea that you can nest all these things and kind of put them as children of other things. Inner blocks are really useful, but there's some limitations, and one of them is you actually can only use one per block. So if you have two inner blocks, like let's say you have two areas where you want to nest things, it doesn't work. There's like one scope for inner blocks and the content is going to be duplicated everywhere. All right, I'm down to 5 minutes. So, questions? Yes.
It's very interesting. When you started, you showed, kind of what you see is what you get, and it seemed very easy. And then you dived into, the coding, like who's using what, like who's doing the part that you just showed, and who's doing the part where they don't have to code, or it's the same person.
Well, so do you mean? Well, to get the custom blocks, you have to do that stuff that I showed.
So there's no way to use Gutenberg without...
Oh, you can use Gutenberg. You can install plugins that have Gutenberg. You can use the default things. That was just how do you build the custom blocks. Yeah. Yes.
So you talked about having access to all these thousands of NPM modules, and WordPress is running React for us in the editor. What are the security concerns with issues with exposure in the NPM modules?
So I'm not worried about that, and that's because you're running it in the editor, and I guess there is the potential that there is some kind of code that is like sending data off to someone else. I guess I treat NPM modules like I do WordPress plugins. How many people are using it? Is it started by? What are the downloads like? I'm not too worried about that. If it was running in the client side, I'd be more worried about it. But yeah. Yes.
It looks like the documentation for how to do this is still very rough and very much a moving target. What have you used and what do you recommend to actually get up on being able to do this sort of thing?
This is not a good answer, but the most helpful thing for me has been going and reading the Gutenberg source code. I don't know if anybody else had that experience that's built Gutenberg blocks.
You have to. In some cases, there's no choice. There's no documentation, and you have to go to the code. There's no.
Yeah, I think that's the sad reality of it right now. Yes.
So for the actual rendered markup that one of these blocks spits out, you define that within the JSX?
Yeah, so that's your save method.
Okay.
And then WordPress does wrap that in HTML comments that just says this is the type of block it is. And then if you don't attach an attribute to a selector, it will put in the JSON of your attribute data.
Okay, and that just renders as normal HTML and running, I think.
Yeah, I think the comments still show up, but that's invisible unless you have the inspector open.
Super cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's in the comments.
Okay, it strips it out. Oh, okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
No.
Any other questions? I know that was a hard topic for the last of the day. So if you didn't, I don't know, there's the slides at the bottom. I think I have a few other there's a few other things maybe on there. Take a look. Feel free to write me questions. It's real. I think I'm biased, right? It's really hard for me to know because I've been doing React for over a couple of years, but I don't think it's as hard as most people think. And hopefully my goal is, like, in doing these talks, to say, like, hey, you can do these really cool things and you don't actually have to write that much code. So I don't know if I've inspired you or scared you. But for those of you who have tried it, has it been easier than, what do you think? Has anybody tried it?
It depends on what you want it to do.
Yeah.
I tried to do slides from them,
Okay.
but I tried simply because, yeah, I mean, it looks really bad.
Yeah, it's not that bad. And don't start with a pie chart. Start with something simpler. Okay, well, thank you very much.